Mom, this is who I choose. Those 7 simple words stopped an entire ballroom full of wealthy and powerful people from speaking. 1 second earlier, everyone had been smiling, raising glasses, and waiting for me to announce my engagement to one of the most successful men in the country. The next second, my 8-year-old son changed everything. My name is Charlotte Hayes. At 38, I was the founder and CEO of one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America. Magazine covers called me brilliant. Business networks called me unstoppable. Online articles called me the most eligible single woman in the country. But none of those titles mattered as much to me as one word, Mom. For years, Ethan had been the center of my world. After my marriage ended, I poured every ounce of energy into raising him and building the company that would secure our future. Somewhere along the way, the public became fascinated with my personal life. Reporters constantly asked when I would get married again. Investors asked. Friends asked. Even strangers asked. Eventually, during a televised interview, I laughed and said something that followed me for years. If I ever get married again, I told the host, it will be to the man my son chooses. The audience loved it. Nearly 500 guests attended. Business leaders, celebrities. I assumed he was tired. After all, it had been a long night. Then, just before I stepped onto the stage for the final announcement, Ethan slipped his small hand into mine. Mom, he said softly. I found him. The room erupted with laughter. Guests thought he was being adorable. I smiled too. Found who? I asked. Ethan looked around the ballroom and pointed. The man you should marry. More laughter followed. Cameras turned toward us. Someone shouted that they wanted to see who the lucky man was. Ethan didn't hesitate. He walked away from our table and headed across the ballroom. Past the investors. Past the celebrities. Past Victor. Past every powerful person in the room. I followed him, confused. The crowd parted as he moved. Then he stopped near the back wall, beside a man nobody had been paying attention to. The man wore an older Navy suit. His tie was slightly crooked. He looked uncomfortable being there. Beside him stood a little girl holding his hand. Ethan looked up at him and smiled. Then he grabbed the man's hand and turned toward me. The entire ballroom fell silent. And for the first time that night, I truly noticed Ryan Carter. For several seconds, nobody moved. The orchestra had stopped playing. The photographers lowered their cameras. Even Victor Langley seemed frozen beside the stage. Ryan Carter looked just as surprised as everyone else. He glanced down at Ethan, then toward me, as if he was certain some mistake had been made. The little girl standing beside him tightened her grip on his hand and hid partially behind his arm. She could not have been older than 7. Her long blonde hair was pulled into a simple ponytail, and she wore a pale blue dress that looked carefully pressed but far less expensive than the designer outfits filling the ballroom. Ryan cleared his throat. I think your son might have the wrong person, he said quietly. His voice was calm, respectful, and completely different from the confident voices I had listened to all evening. Ethan immediately shook his head. No, I do not. The certainty in his answer surprised me. My son was polite, thoughtful, and rarely spoke without thinking. If he said something, there was usually a reason. Ethan, I said gently as I approached them, why did you choose him? Hundreds of eyes turned toward my son. Instead of looking nervous, he seemed relieved, as though he had finally been waiting for someone to ask the question. Because he is good, he answered. A few people laughed softly. Others exchanged amused looks. In a room filled with billionaires, executives, and public figures, the answer sounded almost childish. Yet Ethan remained serious. Lots of people are successful, he continued. But not many people are good when nobody is watching. The laughter disappeared. Ryan looked uncomfortable. The little girl beside him stared at the floor. I noticed her shoes then. White shoes with tiny silver stars on them. One of the stars had partially peeled away. It was such a small detail, but somehow it stood out against all the luxury surrounding us. How do you know him? I asked. Ethan looked up at Ryan before answering. We met a long time ago. Ryan immediately shook his head. I do not think so. But Ethan smiled. You do not remember me. Something changed in Ryan's expression. Not recognition. Curiosity. He studied Ethan more carefully. Meanwhile, whispers began spreading through the ballroom. I could almost hear the assumptions forming. People thought Ryan was chasing attention. Others assumed he had somehow coached my son. A few reporters were already typing on their phones. I knew tomorrow's headlines would be brutal. Yet Ryan did not look excited. He looked like a man who wished he could disappear. "Daddy," the little girl whispered, tugging on his sleeve. "Can we go home now?" Ryan gave her a reassuring smile. "Soon, sweetheart." Then he looked at me. "Miss Hayes, I am sorry for the disruption. We were actually about to leave." Before I could answer, Ethan stepped forward again. "Please do not leave." The room fell quiet once more. My son reached into the inside pocket of his small blazer and carefully pulled out an old photograph. The edges were worn. The colors had faded. He handed it to me without saying a word. I looked down. The moment I saw the picture, my heart skipped. Because standing in the background, several years younger and wearing a familiar smile, was Ryan Carter. For a moment, the ballroom disappeared around me. The voices, the cameras, the glittering lights beyond the windows all faded into the background as I stared at the photograph in my hands. It was taken nearly 5 years earlier at a community picnic in a public park outside Chicago. Ethan was only 3 years old then. I remembered the day because it had been one of the few weekends I had managed to spend away from the office during the most demanding period of my career. The photograph showed Ethan sitting at a picnic table, smiling proudly while holding a paper kite he had decorated himself. Behind him stood a younger version of Ryan Carter. He was not posing. He was not even looking at the camera. He appeared to be adjusting the string of the kite, while Ethan watched him with complete trust. Slowly, another memory surfaced. Not a clear one, just fragments. Warm sunshine, green grass, children running across an open field. My phone ringing nonstop with work calls. Ethan chasing his kite farther than I realized. Then worry. A brief moment of panic when I could not immediately find him. I remembered searching through the crowd, my heart racing, until I finally spotted him laughing near a tall man who had helped untangle the kite from a tree branch. I had thanked the man quickly before rushing back to another business call. I never learned his name. I never expected to see him again. Yet now, standing in front of hundreds of guests, I realized that man had been Ryan. "You were there," I said quietly. Ryan looked at the photograph and smiled faintly. I remember the kite. Ethan's face lit up. I knew it. The little girl beside Ryan looked up at her father. "You never told me that story." Ryan shrugged gently. Because it was not much of a story. Ethan immediately disagreed. It was to me. The sincerity in his voice made the room feel strangely smaller. Around us, the whispers continued. Some guests looked confused. Others seemed impatient. They wanted drama. They wanted a scandal or a shocking revelation. Instead, they were witnessing something far simpler. A forgotten act of kindness. Victor finally stepped forward. His smile remained polite, but I could see tension behind it. "Charlotte," he said carefully, "perhaps this conversation would be better handled privately." Several people nodded. It was the sensible suggestion, the professional suggestion, the suggestion that would allow the evening to return to its planned course. Yet Ethan shook his head before I could respond. No, his voice was soft, but it carried through the silent ballroom. "People should know." I looked at my son, then at Ryan, then at the little girl standing beside him. She was still holding his hand. Not because she was nervous, because she trusted him completely. It was the same expression Ethan wore whenever he looked at someone he felt safe with. And suddenly I realized something that unsettled me more than all the cameras in the room. My son had not chosen Ryan because of one afternoon in a park. He had been watching him for much longer than that. And somehow, without me noticing, Ethan knew things about this man that I did not. The gala finally ended nearly an hour later, but the conversations it started refused to end. Long after the last guests left the ballroom, reporters continued gathering outside the hotel entrance, hoping for statements. I gave none. Victor left without arguing, although the disappointment on his face was impossible to miss. Ryan tried to leave quietly as well, but Ethan would not allow it. My son spent the rest of the evening talking to Lily as though they had known each other for years. Watching them together felt strange. Children usually needed time to build trust. Yet these two laughed easily, sharing stories about school projects, favorite books, and their pets. Eventually, I invited Ryan and Lily to join us for a late dinner in one of the hotel's private dining rooms. Nothing formal, just a chance to understand what was happening. Ryan hesitated before accepting. Throughout the meal, he spoke very little about himself. Instead, he asked questions about Ethan. What subjects he liked in school. Whether he enjoyed baseball. If he still flew kites. The conversation felt natural in a way that surprised me. Most people who sat across from me eventually brought up my company, my investments, or my public profile. Ryan never did. He seemed completely uninterested in any of it. At one point, Ethan excused himself to show Lily a collection of model airplanes displayed in the hotel lobby. The moment they disappeared around the corner, I finally asked the question that had been bothering me all evening. How exactly do you know my son? Ryan smiled faintly and stirred his coffee. I think the better question is how he knows me. Then he explained. About 18 months earlier, he and Lily had started volunteering every Saturday morning at a neighborhood community center. They helped organize children's reading programs and outdoor activities. One weekend, Ethan had arrived with a school group participating in a local service project. Ryan recognized him immediately from the old picnic years ago. Ethan did not recognize Ryan at first, but over time, they crossed paths again and again. Reading events, charity drives, community cleanups. Nothing dramatic, just ordinary moments. Why did nobody tell me? I asked. Ryan looked genuinely confused. I assumed you knew. The truth embarrassed me more than I wanted to admit. My schedule had become a carefully organized machine. Drivers, assistants, tutors, security staff, every hour planned. Somewhere in that system, I had stopped noticing small details. Meanwhile, Ethan had been building a friendship with someone I barely knew. Dad always helps people, Lily said suddenly as she returned to the table. Her small voice interrupted my thoughts. Ryan immediately looked uncomfortable. Lily, but she continued anyway. He fixes things for people when they cannot afford repairs. He says everybody needs help sometimes. Ryan sighed and looked down at his coffee. Not because he was proud, because he clearly wished the subject would disappear. That reaction stayed with me. Most people advertised every good deed they ever performed. Ryan seemed determined to hide his. Later that night, after everyone went home, I sat alone in my penthouse apartment overlooking the city skyline. The lights of Chicago stretched for miles beyond the windows. Normally, that view calmed me. Tonight, it did not. I kept thinking about something Ethan had said. Not many people are good when nobody is watching. Then I opened my laptop and quietly instructed my assistant to prepare a complete background report on Ryan Carter. By sunrise, I planned to learn everything there was to know about him. The report arrived at 7:12 the next morning. I was already awake, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Chicago was just beginning to wake up outside my windows. Traffic moved slowly below. The city looked calm. My thoughts were not. I opened the file expecting to find complications. Everyone has complications. I expected debts, lawsuits, questionable decisions, something that would explain why a man like Ryan Carter made my son admire him so much. Instead, the first few pages only deepened the mystery. Ryan had worked for years as a firefighter before leaving the profession after an injury that made the demanding schedule difficult to maintain. Afterward, he started a small home repair business. Nothing glamorous. Nothing that would ever make headlines. Yet page after page revealed the same pattern. Volunteer work, community projects, donations made anonymously, references from neighbors who described him as dependable, teachers who praised his involvement in local youth programs, elderly homeowners who mentioned that he often refused payment when they could not afford repairs. One note caught my attention. 3 winters earlier, an elderly widow had lost heat during a severe cold spell. Ryan spent an entire weekend fixing her furnace and never sent a bill. Another report described him organizing volunteers to repair storm damage for several families. Again, no publicity, no social media posts, no interviews, just quiet work. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. In the corporate world, people spent millions of dollars building reputations. Ryan seemed to have earned one accidentally. A notification appeared on my phone, then another, then 10 more. By 8 o'clock, every major news outlet was discussing what happened at the gala. Photos of Ryan and Ethan were everywhere. Some articles called it heartwarming. Others were far less kind. Comment sections filled with speculation. People questioned Ryan's motives. They questioned mine. Several commentators suggested he had manipulated Ethan for personal gain. Reading those accusations bothered me more than I expected. Nothing in the report supported them. Yet public opinion rarely waited for evidence. Around noon, my assistant informed me that several board members wanted an emergency meeting. Their concern was not hidden. My company had spent years building a carefully controlled image. Now a complete stranger was dominating the headlines. During the meeting, some executives urged caution. Others suggested creating distance from the story before it affected investors. I listened quietly. Then one board member asked the question everyone had been circling around. Can you honestly say you know this man? The room became silent. The truthful answer should have been no. I barely knew him. Yet before I could respond, another thought entered my mind. Most of the people sitting around that table had known me professionally for over a decade. Very few of them knew who I was when cameras were gone. Maybe knowing someone was not about time. Maybe it was about character. That evening, after work, I drove across the city without telling anyone where I was going. The address from Ryan's file led me to a modest neighborhood lined with maple trees and brick homes. I parked across the street and watched. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. Sprinklers watered front lawns. It felt like a different world from corporate boardrooms and luxury hotels. Then I saw Ryan. He was kneeling beside a neighbor's mailbox, helping an elderly man replace a damaged wooden post. No cameras. No reporters. No audience. Just another ordinary act of kindness. As I watched from inside my car, my phone suddenly rang. The caller ID showed Victor Langley. I answered. His voice sounded calm, but there was something beneath it that immediately put me on alert. Charlotte, he said, there is something important you should know about Ryan Carter. Victor remained silent for several seconds after speaking. I watched Ryan across the street through my windshield while waiting for him to continue. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neighborhood. Ryan had finished repairing the mailbox and was now helping the elderly man carry a small bag of groceries toward the front porch. Nothing about the scene matched the warning in Victor's voice. What is it? I finally asked. A few years ago, Ryan was involved in a lawsuit, Victor replied. I thought you should know before this goes any further. My grip tightened around the phone. What kind of lawsuit? That is exactly the problem, he said. Nobody seems willing to talk about it. The answer felt carefully constructed. Not a fact. A suggestion. The kind designed to create doubt without providing evidence. If you have information, send it to me, I said. I will look at it. Victor agreed and ended the call. 10 minutes later, an email arrived. I opened it immediately. The documents described a legal dispute involving a construction company and a property renovation project. Ryan's name appeared several times. At first glance, it looked serious. I read every page. Then I read them again. Something felt wrong. The details were incomplete. Important sections were missing. Context had been removed. The more carefully I examined the documents, the less convincing they became. Instead of finding answers, I found questions. That night, media coverage intensified. Television commentators debated Ryan's character. Online articles speculated about hidden motives. Some claimed he was chasing fame. Others suggested he had deliberately positioned himself near my family. None of them presented proof. Yet millions of people were already forming opinions. The next morning, Ethan walked into the kitchen while I was reading another article. He glanced at the screen and frowned. They do not know him. I closed the laptop. People make assumptions. Ethan climbed onto a chair across from me. That is not fair. His response was simple, honest, and difficult to argue with. Later that afternoon, I decided to stop relying on reports and headlines. I drove back to Ryan's neighborhood. This time I knocked on his front door. Ryan answered wearing a gray work shirt with paint stains near one sleeve. He looked surprised to see me. Charlotte, can we talk? I asked. A shadow of concern crossed his face, but he stepped aside and invited me in. The house was modest, clean, and filled with signs of real life. School drawings hung on the refrigerator. Books sat stacked beside the couch. A half-finished science project occupied part of the dining table. Lily waved from the living room before returning to her homework. Nothing felt staged. Nothing felt calculated. After a few minutes, I placed the printed documents on the table between us. Ryan looked down at them. The color drained slightly from his face. Not with guilt, with recognition. Then he released a slow breath and sat back in his chair. I wondered how long it would take before someone found those, he said quietly. I studied him carefully. Then tell me what really happened. Ryan stared at the papers for a long moment before finally meeting my eyes. The story everyone believes, he said, is not the truth. Ryan remained quiet for several moments after speaking. The kitchen clock ticked softly somewhere behind me. Outside, I could hear children playing farther down the street. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Yet the tension at that table felt impossible to ignore. Finally, Ryan opened a drawer and removed a worn manila folder. The edges were bent from years of use. He placed it beside the documents I had brought. "Everything is in there," he said. "I kept it because one day I thought someone might ask." I opened the folder carefully. Inside were emails, inspection reports, court filings, photographs, and signed statements. Hundreds of pages. The deeper I looked, the clearer the story became. Years earlier, Ryan had been hired by a large construction company to oversee renovation work on several affordable housing units. During the project, he discovered serious safety violations and reported them. According to the records, the company ignored his concerns. When he refused to approve the work, he became the target of legal action designed to shift responsibility onto him. The lawsuit Victor mentioned had never been about dishonesty. It had been retaliation. "You could have fought this publicly," I said. Ryan smiled sadly. "With what money?" I had no answer. He pointed toward the documents. The case was eventually dismissed. The records are public. But by then, the damage was done. People remembered the accusation. Nobody paid attention when the truth came out. I understood exactly what he meant. I had seen it happen countless times in business. Headlines traveled fast. Corrections traveled slowly. Lily entered the kitchen carrying a notebook from school. She placed it on the table without noticing the documents. "Dad, can you help me with my science questions later?" Ryan's expression immediately softened. "Of course." She smiled and walked away. The change in him was impossible to miss. The guarded man discussing legal battles disappeared. The father remained. As I drove home that evening, I could not stop thinking about the folder. Not because it cleared Ryan's name, because he had never tried to clear it himself. He never posted explanations online, never launched campaigns, never demanded sympathy. He simply continued living his life. The next morning, a new headline exploded across social media. Someone had leaked selected pages from the old lawsuit. The articles omitted the dismissal. They omitted the supporting evidence. They omitted almost everything that mattered. By lunchtime, public opinion had shifted dramatically. Television panels debated whether Ryan had deceived everyone. Commentators questioned his character. Investors began contacting my office. Board members requested another emergency meeting. The pressure intensified by the hour. Then Ethan walked into my office carrying his backpack. Without saying a word, he placed something on my desk. It was another photograph. This one showed Ryan standing beside a group of children at the community center. On the back, written in Ethan's careful handwriting, were 6 simple words. "Good people are worth defending." I stared at the sentence for a long time. Then my phone rang. The caller was one of the investigators my company occasionally hired for sensitive matters. The first thing he said made my heart stop. "Miss Hayes, we found evidence showing who leaked those documents. And I do not think you are going to like the answer." The investigator did not waste time. "The leak came from someone with access to archived legal records and private media contacts," he said. "We traced the communication trail." I leaned forward in my chair. "Who?" There was a brief pause. "Victor Langley." The words settled heavily into the silence. For several seconds, I simply stared through the glass wall of my office at the city below. Cars moved through the streets. People hurried along sidewalks. Life continued normally while everything inside my world shifted once again. "Are you certain?" I asked. "Completely." Within minutes, additional files began arriving in my inbox. Emails, messages, financial records. None of them showed anything illegal. What they showed was something else. A deliberate effort to damage Ryan's reputation before public opinion could settle in his favor. The timing matched perfectly. Every negative article, every selective leak, every anonymous source. Someone had been carefully guiding the story. I closed the files and sat back. What bothered me most was not the manipulation itself. It was the reason behind it. Victor already had wealth, influence, status. Yet he was willing to destroy another person's reputation simply because he viewed him as an obstacle. That evening, I called Ryan. He answered after the second ring. "Hello, Charlotte." His voice sounded tired. "You knew, did you not?" I asked. "About Victor?" A short silence followed. "I suspected. Why did you not tell me?" Ryan laughed softly, though there was little humor in it. "Because it would have sounded like an excuse. People believe what they want to believe." I looked out the window. "That is not always true." "Maybe not," he replied. "But it usually takes time for the truth to catch up." The next day, I attended another board meeting. The atmosphere was tense. Several members still worried about investor reactions. Others worried about media attention. For the first time in years, I found myself paying less attention to financial projections and more attention to character. One executive questioned whether continuing this public association was worth the risk. Before I could answer, Ethan's words returned to me. Good people are worth defending. The meeting ended without a final decision. As I walked back to my office, my assistant hurried toward me carrying a tablet. You need to see this. A new video had appeared online. It was recorded at the community center. The footage showed children participating in a reading program. Ryan sat in a circle surrounded by them. No speeches. No cameras he knew about. No performance. Just patience. Encouragement. Kindness. The comments beneath the video were different from the articles. Parents shared stories. Teachers shared stories. Neighbors shared stories. One by one, people who actually knew Ryan began speaking. The narrative started changing. Slowly. Naturally. Truth was finally finding its voice. That night, I met Ethan on the balcony outside our apartment. The city lights stretched across the horizon. He looked up at me. You know now, do not you? I smiled. Know what? Why I picked him? I rested my hand on his shoulder. I think I am beginning to understand. Ethan nodded toward the skyline. Then you have to decide. Decide what? He looked at me with a wisdom that felt impossible for an 8-year-old boy. Whether you trust what everyone says, or what you know is real. 3 days later, I stood behind a stage in a packed conference hall while television crews prepared for a live press event. Reporters filled every seat. Investors, board members, and industry leaders lined the front rows. The entire country seemed to be waiting for a statement. Rumors had been spreading for weeks. Some people expected damage control. Others expected an engagement announcement. A few predicted a public scandal. The truth was much simpler. For the first time in a very long time, I was going to speak honestly. Ethan sat beside me backstage, swinging his feet gently from his chair. He looked calm, much calmer than I felt. Are you nervous? I asked. He smiled. Not really. Then he added, because now you know. A few minutes later, my name was announced. The room erupted with flashes from hundreds of cameras. I walked onto the stage and stepped behind the podium. The noise slowly faded. Every face in the audience turned toward me. I looked down at the prepared speech in my hands. Then I folded it and set it aside. For most of my life, I believed success came from making the smartest decision in the room. The audience listened quietly. But recently, my son taught me something different. Intelligence matters. Experience matters. Reputation matters. Yet none of those things matter if you cannot recognize genuine character when you see it. A large screen behind me illuminated. Documents appeared. Verified records. Court dismissals. Community testimonials. Evidence showing the truth about the old lawsuit. Evidence exposing how selective information had been leaked to damage an innocent person's reputation. A wave of whispers spread across the room. Then came silence again. The kind of silence that follows certainty. I did not mention Victor by name. I did not need to. The facts spoke for themselves. When the presentation ended, I stepped away from the podium. Then I looked toward the side of the stage. Ryan stood there with Lily. Neither of them seemed comfortable with the attention. Ethan immediately ran toward them. Lily laughed as he grabbed her hand. The sight made several people in the audience smile. I walked across the stage and stopped beside Ryan. He looked at me as though he still could not understand why any of this was happening. You never tried to impress me, I said quietly into the microphone. You never tried to gain anything from me. You simply lived according to your values, even when nobody was watching. The room remained silent. In a world full of people trying to be important, you chose to be kind. Ryan lowered his eyes briefly. Then he looked back at me. There was no triumph in his expression. No pride. Just humility. The same quality Ethan had recognized long before I did. I reached for his hand. Cameras flashed across the room. Yet somehow the moment felt private. Real. Human. Ethan grinned from ear to ear. Lily rolled her eyes at him, which only made him laugh harder. Looking at the four of us standing together, I finally understood what my son had seen from the beginning. Not perfection. Not status. Not wealth. Trust. The kind that cannot be bought, marketed, or manufactured. As the audience rose to its feet, I glanced down at Ethan. He smiled back at me and shrugged as if the answer had always been obvious. Maybe it had. After all, the smartest person in the room had never been the billionaire the executive, or the expert. It had been an 8-year-old boy who knew that the safest heart is worth more than all the success in the world.